Inspector Purbright had long since perfected the art of inquiry as performance. In Flaxborough, where people would cheerfully tell you more than you ever wished to know, it was seldom necessary to demand information. One needed only to arrange the chairs, pour the tea, and permit silences to accumulate like polite dust until the other party felt compelled to fill them. There were, as a rule, 3 certainties about the Flaxborough Flower and Produce Show. First, Mrs. Glossop would once again claim her marrow to be largely self-raised, by which she meant her husband had merely been roped into carrying it. Second, Mr. Brindle, the butcher, would turn up in a tweed suit that had not been fashionable since Neville Chamberlain was. And third, the Reverend Geoffrey Slatherwick would submit a modestly sized bouquet of sweet peas that no one could quite bring themselves to award first prize to, but which always earned a certificate in the end for notable endeavour. This year's gathering began in precisely the same fashion. Rows of dahlias leaned in conspiratorial fashion across polished trestle tables. Tomatoes gleamed with a devotion to varnish that suggested their growers owned both greenhouses and shoe polish, and the air was thick with that blend of civic pride and restrained envy which could only be found when neighbours measured cucumbers with the severity of duellists. The small-town rituals were proceeding with admirable regularity until the discovery of the spade. It was not the presence of a spade. Of course, that caused the murmurs. Spades had been known on rare and reckless occasions to appear even in flower shows. It was rather the fact that this particular specimen had been thrust into a corner of the produce tent with its blade still bearing an unmistakable coating of earth, not greenhouse loam, but the heavy, clayey soil of the churchyard. Mrs. Glossop, whose interest seldom extended beyond marrows and melodrama, was the first to announce, in a voice cultivated for the Wesleyan choir, "That's not potting soil, that's grave dirt." She would not have been believed had not Mr. Brindle, a man given to unhelpful confirmations, muttered, "Looks like it's off the vicarage plot all right. Same muck as sticks to me boots when I take the shortcut after licensing hours." The Reverend Slatherwick, called upon to give account, turned curiously pale and offered the feeble explanation that the tool was not his. "I've not handled a spade in weeks," he said, which was a lie of the gentle, desperate sort peculiar to clergymen caught out in minor fibs. For the good Reverend had, that very Tuesday, been observed from across the church wall, sleeves rolled above his elbows, performing some solitary exertions in the twilight. By the time the competition judge was persuaded to announce the marrow winners, the spade had become the only thing anyone wished to discuss. Gossip loped across the marquee faster than the WI ladies could refill their teapots. By 4 o'clock, it was an accepted fact that the vicar had not merely been gardening, but had dug something up, or, depending on which part of the tent one stood in, dug something down. Inspector Purbright, who had attended merely to fulfill a minor civic duty of presence, found himself inevitably summoned into the matter. His approach to the offending spade was studiedly mild. He looked at it as a man might at a newspaper puzzle. Something to be solved in its own time, but not before supper. "I wonder," Purbright murmured to Sergeant Love, "how many crimes have begun with a perfectly innocent piece of cutlery, a knife, a fork, and now a spade?" Sergeant Love, eager as ever to exhibit deduction, said, "You don't suppose the vicar's been digging up bones, sir?" "Quite the reverse, perhaps," Purbright replied. His expression was unreadable, though one corner of his mouth twitched as if resisting the temptation to smile. The spade, in all its soil-stained glory, was carried to the police station by 2 constables who managed to make it appear they were transporting a relic of great sanctity. Meanwhile, the Reverend Slatherwick lingered at the edge of the crowd, issuing polite assurances that whatever it was It must all be some regrettable mistake. Flaxborough, however, had already decided otherwise. By dusk, the town was abuzz with two certainties: that the vicar had been caught burying something unholy, and that Inspector Purbright, who had not yet said more than 3 sentences about the matter, already knew precisely what it was. By the following morning, the business of the spade had assumed proportions not normally achieved in Flaxborough, except in times of flooding, contested elections, or the discovery of foreign objects in pork pies. The first public airing of the matter occurred in Wainwright's or tea rooms, where Mrs. Glossop, fortified with a pot of her customary assam and a bun that defied both dentistry and digestion, declared with satisfied solemnity, "I said it was grave dirt, and grave dirt it is. Nobody believed me at the time, but they'll be believing me soon enough when it's all over the Gazette." Her audience, chiefly the Mrs. Hubblethwaite, whose diet consisted largely of seed cake and innuendo, nodded as if privy to "revelations withheld from Scotland Yard." "It makes you wonder," whispered Miss Agnes Hubblethwaite, "what a priest has any need to be burying by himself in the evening, with no one about. Unless—" She let the suspense hang, as though expecting a chorus. "Unless he's burying something he wouldn't want dug up," supplied her sister triumphantly. From that point onward, conjecture blossomed unchecked. The version retailed to Mrs. Platt, the newsagent's wife, had the Reverend concealing bottles of communion wine in the soil to keep them cool, though why such thrift required moonlit secrecy was never explained. By the time Sergeant Love overheard a snatch of conversation outside the cooperative stores, the act had become positively gothic. Slatherwick had interred an entire coffin, contents unmentionable, with his own trembling hands. Purbright, who moved through these reports with the detachment of a man reading yesterday's racing results, noted chiefly the velocity with which gossip travelled. He had learned long ago that in Flaxborough the truth lagged far behind rumour, and usually arrived only after the scandal had been neatly tied up, boxed, and distributed among its inhabitants. At the police station, meanwhile, the clerical spade was receiving more attention than any weapon in living memory. Constable Bale, who was put in charge of it temporarily, confessed that he had been afraid to leave it in the evidence cupboard. "Seems wrong, sir," he explained earnestly to Purbright, "locking up a spade in with knives and coches, like putting a Sunday school lad in Borstal." By noon, the Flaxborough Gazette had prepared a cautious paragraph for its front page, hinting that certain irregularities connected with ecclesiastical horticulture had lately come to light. The editor, Mr. Wykes, congratulated himself on a turn of phrase that would permit the more scandal-minded to read between the lines, while allowing the diocesan authorities to take umbrage only if they had energy to spare. At the vicarage, the Reverend Slatherwick himself endured a different trial. Parishioners, who on other days might have called to discuss jumble sales or hymn numbers, now arrived in ones and twos to press polite but searching inquiries. Mrs. Wapshot, whose sense of Christian charity was rivalled only by her appetite for revelation, brought a jar of chutney as pretext. She stayed 40 minutes and left with a face pinched into expressions of grave sympathy. By tea-time, she was assuring anyone within earshot that the vicar had admitted a matter of conscience. In the snug of the Lamb and Flag public house, opinions were more robust. Mr. Brindle, refreshed by draught bitter and his own authority, declared, "It's smuggling, that's what it is. Digging holes in the churchyard, hiding goods from customs. You wait, there'll be foreign tobacco under them graves, mark my words." "Why would a priest be smuggling tobacco?" asked Mr. Mallison, the draper, who prided himself on occasional logic. "To sell it on," replied Brindle, as though the answer were obvious. "Clergymen don't get rich on sermons, you know. The conversation might have ended there had not Constable Garraway, who had been stationed discreetly at the bar, attempted to improve upon the tale by suggesting that bodies had been moved about in the night for reasons best known to them as shiftedom. This contribution was greeted with relish, and within the hour half the town believed the churchyard was undergoing a sinister rearrangement. Through it all, Inspector Purbright remained a figure of quiet courtesy. When asked, which was frequently, whether the Reverend was to be charged, he responded with an expression so blandly affable that it conveyed no more information than a parish notice board in February. What Purbright did observe, however, with the attentiveness of a man who preferred people's behaviour to their words, was the way Slatherwick carried himself about town. The priest was scrupulously polite, even more than usual, but his hands betrayed a faint tremor when he lifted a teacup, and his eyes shifted at questions that would otherwise have merited a simple laugh. If Flaxborough as a whole was warming itself at the bonfire of speculation, the Reverend was very clearly feeling the heat. That evening, as Sergeant Love brought in yet another second-hand report, this one alleging that Slatherwick had been seen purchasing a wheelbarrow large enough to fit a man in, Purbright merely smiled, leaned back in his chair, and remarked, "It is most instructive, Love, to watch how quickly a town can bury the truth beneath a mound of invention, almost as if they were practicing for a funeral." It was in this spirit that Purbright called first at the vicarage. The Reverend Slatherwick, though outwardly composed, looked as though he had been engaged in a prolonged contest with insomnia. His clerical collar sat slightly askew, and his smile was as brittle as a communion wafer left too long in a damp vestry. "My dear Inspector," Slatherwick began, ushering Purbright into the vicarage sitting-room with the exaggerated cheer of a man determined not to appear flustered, "I can imagine this absurd business must have caused you a great deal of unnecessary inconvenience." "Not at all," Purbright replied mildly. "We in the police force are quite accustomed to absurdities. They make life tolerably interesting." The vicar, uncertain whether he was being teased, produced a tray of biscuits that suggested he had raided the church fete leftovers. He hovered, while Purbright selected a particularly angular custard cream. "The spade," Purbright said at last, as though naming an uninvited guest. "It would be helpful if you could explain how it came to rest in the flower show tent, still bearing evidence of recent use." Slatherwick coughed delicately. "Ah, yes, quite. Well, the truth is I had lent it to a parishioner for some gardening, entirely ordinary gardening, I assure you. It seems it was mislaid." "And the parishioner?" "Ah, well, that would be Mr. Clagwell. Yes, Mr. Clagwell of Larch Avenue." Purbright made no attempt to conceal his scribbling, though his notes contained nothing more than the words "invented name." The Reverend's attempt at levity soon collapsed under the weight of Purbright's tranquil silence. At length Slatherwick muttered, "I may possibly have been myself engaged in a little gardening at the churchyard. Nothing sinister, merely the replanting of a yew. By twilight, it is the only time one can work uninterrupted." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "Graveyards are rarely crowded after dusk." Leaving the vicar to his uneasily stacked biscuits, Purbright moved on to less directly implicated townsfolk. His method was to allow each citizen to embroider freely upon their theories, noting only the stitches that appeared out of place. Mrs. Wapshot, visited at her kitchen table while a stew of questionable ancestry simmered on the hob, spoke with an air of triumphant benevolence. "The Reverend told me himself, Inspector, why in confidence, of course, that he had been moved to certain nocturnal exertions by reasons of conscience, which is only natural in a clergyman. Conscience, I mean, Digging holes, perhaps less so. Still one mustn't pry. Purbright agreed with admirable solemnity, though he did permit himself the observation that Mrs. Wapshot's understanding of confidentiality appeared highly portable. At the Lamb and Flag, Purbright encountered a more robust witness in Mr. Brindle, who assured him that if the police wished to investigate smuggling, they could do worse than examine the condition of the communion wine. No vintage English claret ever tasted that foreign, he insisted, pounding the table until his pint trembled. Sergeant Love, who had been dispatched to obtain more specific intelligence, reported instead a collection of elaborate but mutually contradictory tales. Slatherwick had been digging for treasure. Slatherwick had been concealing treasure. Slatherwick had been helping a lady friend plant bulbs. The latter story apparently sourced from Miss Hubblethwaite's attempt to lend the scandal a romantic dimension. Only one remark gave Purbright pause. Old Mr. Carrow, the gravedigger, when approached, had seemed peculiarly reticent. Usually a man who could describe with relish the quality of local soils at every depth, Carrow offered only that he had seen nothing unusual in the churchyard of late. He then added, a shade too quickly, "And anyway, I'm hard of sight after dark." Purbright filed this away, not because he distrusted Carrow, but because hasty disclaimers were often as revealing as confessions. By late afternoon, Flaxborough was convinced it had been thoroughly interviewed, and many households settled down with the satisfaction of having helped the police with their inquiries. Purbright, for his part, returned to his office with nothing so useful as a confession, but with the assurance that contradictions had already begun to sprout like weeds in the fertile soil of the town's imagination. There was, after all, only one certainty in Flaxborough, that the truth would prove far less dramatic, but infinitely more peculiar than anything the townsfolk had yet invented. By Wednesday, the town had all but agreed that the Reverend Slatherwick was guilty of something. Precisely what he was guilty of depended upon which section of the High Street one paused in, but unanimity was firm on the point that he was not innocent. The Borough Council convened that morning for its monthly meeting on drainage and parks, spent a scant 4 minutes on drains, 2 on car parks, and the remainder in thinly veiled discussion of the ecclesiastical situation. Councillor Harbottle, whose moustache was as heavy as his judgments, expressed himself with relish. "We cannot, gentlemen and ladies, pretend that a clergyman seen consorting with soil under questionable circumstances is anything other than, deeply irregular. The dignity of Flaxborough demands decisive action." "What action do you propose?" inquired Alderman Pollitt dryly. "Excommunication? Or shall we simply ask him to resign from the Horticultural Society?" The laughter was thin, for the mood of the room leaned toward condemnation. The Reverend, it was agreed, had embarrassed the borough. One or two even wondered whether police inquiries might, with encouragement, be expedited into charges of interfering with consecrated ground. Word of this council debate soon filtered into the town at large, travelling as usual by way of Mrs. Glossop, who had attended in her capacity as guest of the public gallery, but regarded herself as an indispensable participant. By tea-time, she was explaining in Wainwright's tea-rooms that the council are preparing to suspend the vicar, which had the useful effect of making the whole borough sound like a headmaster's study. In the snug of the Lamb and Flag, meanwhile, more colourful theories flourished. Mr. Brindle announced that the police had enough to charge him now, and that Inspector Purbright was merely tidying up the paperwork. Others nodded gravely, though the paperwork in question consisted chiefly of Purbright's neatly doodled caricature of a marrow. Sergeant Love, more susceptible to the prevailing breeze of suspicion, remarked to his superior that afternoon, "You've got to admit, sir, all the evidence points to the vicar. He was seen digging, the spade's his, and he can't give a straight answer about why he was in the churchyard. Purbright, whose gaze lingered on a moth circling the lamp in his office, replied with deliberate mildness, "When everyone in town agrees on one explanation, love, I find it prudent to look for another. Truth, you see, is a shy creature. It dislikes crowds." Love flushed, not for the first time, at having his eager deduction swatted aside with quiet philosophy. Nevertheless, the machinery of suspicion rattled on. Mrs. Wapshot, in her afternoony calls, pronounced with unction that the poor reverend is clearly suffering from a guilty conscience. I know the look. My late husband had it every time he went near the pantry. This testimony was repeated with approval across the Women's Institute and soon adopted as if it were gospel. By Thursday, the Reverend Slatherwick himself seemed almost persuaded by the case against him. His sermons turned into nervous rambles about temptation and the burden of secrecy, delivered in a voice that shook so pitifully his parishioners could hardly resist nodding in sympathetic condemnation. Purbright, attending one such sermon from the rear pew with the expression of a man politely enduring a tedious but necessary committee, left not with a sense of guilt confirmed, but with the quiet conviction that the Reverend was far too clumsy a liar to have engineered anything of real subtlety. If Slatherwick was indeed guilty, Purbright mused as he walked back through the churchyard, it was not of the crime Flaxborough was busily inventing for him. Inspector Purbright's investigations seldom advanced in a straight line. They tended, instead, to drift like the river Flax itself, slow, meandering, outwardly idle, yet somehow always arriving where they must. It was during one such apparent drift, on a dull Friday morning, that a small but curious fact made itself known. The Reverend Slatherwick, it transpired, had paid an unusual visit to the ironmonger's shop 2 days before the flower and produce show. Mr. Beauchamp, the ironmonger, mentioned this to Sergeant Love with the air of a man sharing intelligence, a profound criminal weight. "Came in asking for oil," Beauchamp said. "Lamp oil, mind you. I told him the church vestry already takes paraffin in bulk, but he wanted a little bottle, small, private-like. Odd thing, eh?" Love dutifully repeated this to Purbright, who listened with one eyebrow raised in polite interest. "What did he buy in the end?" the inspector asked. "Nothing. Said he'd changed his mind, but he left behind his handkerchief, which I recognized. Had his initials stitched, neat as you please. Collected it the next day. Thanked me most heartily, though he looked pale as a ghost." Purbright made no comment at the time, but the matter of a vicar needing lamp oil and then abruptly not needing it lodged in his thoughts. That evening, walking alone past the churchyard, he paused by the lich gate and gazed at the row of lamps that flanked the path. They had been converted to electricity years ago. None had burned oil within living memory. A triviality, perhaps. Yet trivialities, Purbright reflected, often carried more weight than grand gestures. A man might lie boldly about money or marriage, but seldom about lamp oil. The odd detail deepened when Purbright's next call took him to Mr. Carrow, the gravedigger. Carrow, still evasive about his twilight duties, was polishing a set of tools when Purbright appeared. Among the spades and mattocks, Purbright noted a curious absence. "You seem short of one of your implements," he observed lightly. Carrow scowled. "One of the parish spades has gone astray, if that's what you mean. Never kept so close an inventory before." "Which one?" "The narrow blade, the kind best for tidy digging." Carrow said no more, but his manner was sour, as though the very mention of the missing spade had left a taste he could not wash away. When Purbright walked back to the station, he carried with him the faint but persistent impression that the Reverend's story and the gravedigger's silence were threads of the same cloth. A missing spade, a needless request for lamp oil, and a clergyman sweating through his own sermons. These were not the props of melodrama the townsfolk delighted in, but of something quieter, more awkward, and more human. At the Lamb and Flag, that evening, townsfolk continued to embroider the tale with gusto. There was talk of hidden gold, of a clandestine lover, of bodies swapped between graves. None noticed that Purbright, seated at the far end with a modest pint, seemed far less entertained by their drama than by the sight of the vicar himself slipping past the window, head bowed, on his way back from some errand no one had yet accounted for. The inspector's gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Then he returned to his pint, as if no more than the taste required his attention. Flaxborough, being a town of modest size and immodest curiosity, seldom allowed a scandal to remain confined to its original participants. Like a pond that insists on sending ripples to the farthest reeds, the affair of the Reverend Spade was beginning to touch people whose only real connection to it was an eagerness to be thought connected. One such figure was Councillor Mrs. Empson, chairwoman of the Public Amenities Committee, and a woman whose idea of public amenity consisted chiefly of making certain other people had none. She took to pronouncing, at every opportunity, that the whole business points to shocking neglect in graveyard oversight. In practice, this meant she was canvassing support for placing the cemetery under municipal rather than ecclesiastical control, with herself, naturally, as overseer. "Burials," she explained solemnly at the Rotary luncheon, "are a matter of hygiene as well as theology. If the clergy cannot be trusted to use their spades responsibly, then the borough must act." Her pronouncement was relayed to Inspector Purbright by Sergeant Love, who seemed almost impressed by its logic. "It does sound reasonable, sir," Love ventured. "If the Reverend's been misusing his churchyard, perhaps the council ought to—" "Love," Purbright interrupted with gentle patience. "In Flaxborough, whenever someone cries out for responsibility, what they really mean is power, and whenever they talk of hygiene, you may be sure there's dirt of some kind they hope to conceal." Love, chastened but not enlightened, dutifully wrote it down in his notebook as if it were a formula for algebra. A second ripple of consequence reached the home of Mr. and Mrs. Hocknell, proprietors of the town's only respectable boarding house. It was whispered that the Reverend had lately spent a curious half-hour there, not to visit a lodger, but to have a furtive word with Mrs. Hocknell herself. Mrs. Hocknell, a woman whose figure resembled a carefully upholstered sofa, assured neighbours that it had been nothing more than a discussion about hymn-book repair. Unfortunately, the mention of hymns did nothing to discourage speculation. Indeed, it positively inflamed it. By evening, tongues wagged that Slatherwick had been singing in private with the boarding-house mistress, nor was that the end of the expanding cast. Miss Parker, librarian and unofficial archivist of the town's memory, volunteered that she had once lent the Reverend a book on medieval burial customs, which he returned with a bookmark still inserted at a chapter entitled Concealments and Clandestine Interments. She admitted she might have exaggerated the solemnity of his interest, but the rumour, once shared, lost all restraint. Even the chemist became embroiled when it emerged that Slatherwick had purchased, not a week before the affair of the Spade, a packet of camphorated oil. This was immediately seized upon as evidence that he was embalming something, or someone. Amidst this chorus of revelations, Purbright continued to walk his quiet rounds. His interest was less in what was said than in how it was said. The darting eyes, the nervous pauses, the haste with which some declared their certainty. He noticed, for instance, that old Mr. Carrow, the gravedigger, grew increasingly irritable when anyone mentioned Councillor Empson's plan for municipal oversight. "No council busybody's going to tell me where to dig," he muttered one afternoon within earshot of the inspector. "I've buried half this town, and I'll bury the other half too, without their blooming charts and clipboards." Purbright smiled faintly, as if reassured by the man's constancy. Yet the remark left him pondering how jealously a man might guard his patch of earth. By the week's end, the Reverend Slatherwick was no longer the sole character in Flaxborough under suspicion. In coffee shops and parlours, the list of possible culprits expanded to include Mrs. Hocknell for immorality, Councillor Empson for ambition, Mr. Carrow for obstinacy, and even the librarian for literary perversity. The inspector, leafing calmly through his paperwork one evening, summed it up to Love in his characteristically oblique fashion. "You will find, Love, that when a town grows excited over one person's guilt, it is not long before everyone else begins to feel the need of a little guilt of their own. After all, it would be unfair for only one to enjoy the attention." Saturday morning brought a drizzle that settled over Flaxborough with the weary persistence of an unwanted house guest. It was precisely the sort of weather in which nothing of note was expected to occur. Unfortunately for the Reverend Slatherwick, and indeed for the town's appetite for novelty, the drizzle coincided with the discovery of a second disturbance. It was Mrs. Empson who, having appointed herself guardian of public propriety, took it upon her stout self to inspect the churchyard, to ensure, she explained loudly, to no one in particular, that further horticultural outrages are not being committed. What she found was not another spade, but something at once smaller and more curious, an open patch of earth near the eastern wall of the cemetery where the soil had been disturbed. The discovery of a fresh grave, though in truth it was scarcely 2 feet deep and about the size of a laundry basket, sent the borough into paroxysms of speculation. Some insisted it was a hiding place, others a dumping ground. The more imaginative declared it to be the beginnings of an escape tunnel, though to where or from whom was never explained. The constabulary was duly summoned. Sergeant Love, arriving with an enthusiasm quite disproportionate to the occasion, declared that the soil bore clear signs of deliberate digging. He said this with such authority that several onlookers assumed he had recognized the tool marks of a master criminal. The hole itself, however, contained nothing more alarming than a fragment of tarpaulin and a broken jar that smelled faintly of camphor. When informed of the find, Purbright walked to the site with his usual unhurried tread. He studied the shallow excavation for a long moment, then crouched to finger the soil. "Interesting," he murmured. Love brightened. "So it is connected to the Reverend's doings, sir?" Purbright stood, dusting his hands. "It is connected, certainly, but not, I think, in the fashion most people would prefer. You see, Love, this is far too small for a grave, far too careless for a hiding place, and far too near the wall to be part of any respectable gardening." "Then what is it, sir?" "An inconvenience," Purbright replied mildly. "Chiefly to the Reverend, I suspect." The townsfolk were less restrained in their conclusions. By evening the Lamb and Flag was roaring with theories. Mr. Brindle insisted the tarpaulin had once covered contraband, probably brandy. The Hubblethwaite sisters claimed it was the wrappings of a mummified child. Councillor Empson, seizing her chance, thundered that this proved the vicarage incapable of managing sacred ground. A public menace, she called it, fit only for municipal supervision. Even Slatherwick, cornered by parishioners outside the greengrocer's, seemed unable to muster more than a feeble denial. I know nothing about holes," he stammered, which satisfied no one and produced fresh whispers that he had confessed, in all but word. But Purbright, who observed all this with his customary calm, was more struck by what the discovery did not prove. It did not confirm the Reverend's guilt. Indeed, the tarpaulin and camphor suggested someone else entirely had been at work in the churchyard, someone who knew how to shift objects quietly and to cover the scent of their passage. That night, as drizzle thickened into proper rain, Purbright sat in his office with the camphor jar on his desk. He regarded it with a curious, almost affectionate expression, like a man contemplating a crossword clue whose answer he nearly possessed. "Love," he said at last, "do you know what camphor is most commonly used for?" "To keep off moths, sir." "Quite right. Moths. And in a sense, memories. People employ it to preserve what ought not to decay too quickly. An odd thing, don't you think, to find buried beneath a tarpaulin?" Love frowned, baffled. "Do you mean something was hidden there, sir?" Purbright smiled, faintly as always. "Something or someone meant to be kept from spoiling. Though whether it was hidden there or merely passed through remains to be seen." With that, he returned the jar to its wrappings, as if tucking a patient clue into bed. Outside, the bells of St. Swithin's tolled the hour, solemn and oddly reassuring, though to more than a few citizens of Flaxborough they sounded like the knell of an impending scandal larger than any Marrow show could ever produce. Inspector Purbright rarely considered himself a philosopher, but in the quiet hours of Sunday evening, when the town had exhausted its weekend appetite for speculation and retreated behind lace curtains, he found reflection to be unavoidable. He sat at his desk, its surface neatly divided between constabulary memoranda and the obstinate jar of camphor. His pipe, which he rarely lit but frequently held, rested between his fingers. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, offering an air of industrious thought to what was, in fact, something rather nearer to daydreaming. The Reverend Slatherwick, Purbright mused, was a man so ill-equipped for duplicity that he could hardly succeed at lying about his preference for tea over coffee. Yet here he was, cast by the collective imagination of Flaxborough as a conspirator capable of clandestine grave-digging. Was this truly a comment on the Reverend, or more properly a reflection on the townsfolk's desire to see mischief in others? Purbright leaned back, the springs of his chair creaking their familiar complaint. Human beings, he thought, were never so animated as when someone else's error, real or imagined, became available for consumption. An entire town could dine out on scandal for months, living contentedly off the bone and gristle of one man's humiliation. He recalled with faint amusement the recent scandal of the council laundry tender, in which Mrs. Empson had accused the borough engineer of accepting under-the-counter soap flakes. Nothing had been proved, yet the episode still managed to stain reputations as effectively as the very grime it concerned. Slatherwick, he suspected, was becoming another such entree. And then there was the curious matter of the camphor. The object, small and unassuming, spoke of intention. But whose? Camphor was not something acquired lightly in Flaxborough. Its scent was pungent, its purpose singular. Someone had sought to mask, preserve, or perhaps both. Such a person would have the presence of mind to prepare, the boldness to act in a graveyard, and the subtlety to let another bear the blame. Purbright's thoughts wandered to the behaviour of those he had questioned. Mrs. Empson, vigorous, indignant, and forever half an inch from martyrdom. Miss Trodd, anxious, guilt-stricken, and oddly determined to speak before asked. Councillor Empson, opportunistic, eager to reshape scandal into personal leverage. None of them, he decided, were harmless. But not in the sense of innocence. Each possessed an arsenal of quiet motives, sharpened on the whetstone of petty grievances and social ambition. To live in Flaxborough was to participate in a perpetual pageant of self-interest performed under the thin veil of civility. He considered, too, the hole itself, a pit too small for burial yet too deliberate to be chance. Could it have been a failed hiding-place, a discarded trial? Or, and here Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly, could it have been meant as a message of sorts? A hole dug not to conceal, but to be discovered. His pipe, which had long since gone out, hung limply. He placed it on the desk and stared at the lamplight glinting on the jar. The town's gossip would continue, he knew, swelling like a tide, until it lapped against whatever inconvenient truth lay hidden. But his task was not to swim with that tide. It was to watch the eddies, the quiet shifts in current where truth betrayed itself. Purbright's reflections were interrupted by Sergeant Love, who entered with the careful tread of one wishing not to disturb. He carried a ledger. "Evening, sir. Thought you'd like to see this. Parish accounts. Someone at the vestry suggested they might prove of interest." Purbright opened the ledger and allowed his eyes to drift across the neat columns of numbers. They were unremarkable in themselves, save for one small but telling line. An order placed 6 months earlier for medicinal supplies, mothballs, camphor, blocks and sealing wax. Paid for not by the parish, but personally by the Reverend. The inspector closed the book. A less patient man might have leapt to conclusions. Purbright, instead, smiled faintly. "Thank you, love. I think we shall let this simmer." He did not say aloud what he was beginning to suspect, that the Reverend Slatherwick, though hapless in manner, was entangled in something far more deliberate than accidental grave digging. Yet whether he was the spider or the fly, that required further watching. As the bells rang Compline, Purbright folded his hands and reflected that truth in Flaxborough never arrived with a trumpet blast. It sidled politely into the room, hoping not to disturb anyone, until at last it was too late to ignore. Inspector Purbright believed that truth, like cream, rarely rose to the surface unaided. One had to stir the milk gently and persistently until what had been hidden betrayed itself. Tonight, he judged, was a moment for stirring. The opportunity came in the form of a parish discussion evening, an innovation much praised by the Archdeacon and much feared by his clergy. Reverend Slatherwick had been persuaded, or bullied, depending on one's reading of Mrs. Empson's influence, into hosting a gathering in the vestry hall on the theme of tradition and renewal. The hall was ill-lit, as though reluctant to shine too brightly upon the folding chairs, weak urn of tea and mournful biscuits arranged upon paper doilies. About 24 townsfolk assembled, most of them drawn not by the subject matter, but by the happy coincidence of warmth, gossip, and an absence of shilling tickets. Purbright arrived punctually but unobtrusively, declining the tea with the same faint smile he offered to the vicar's harried wife. He took a seat near the back, Sergeant Love beside him, and permitted his eyes to wander across the gathering. There was Mrs. Empson, her features arranged into an expression of moral watchfulness. There was Councillor Empson, attempting unsuccessfully to appear absorbed by the parish hymnals. Miss Trodd, pale and jittering, clutched a notebook as if bracing for examination. And, of course, the Reverend himself, who looked as though he might be forgiven for mislaying the subject of the evening entirely. The discussion began with the Reverend's hesitant remarks on community and continuity, punctuated by coughs of encouragement from his wife. Mrs. Empson soon interrupted, delivering a brisk homily on the dangers of modern slackness. Her remarks meandered, but always seemed to return to the subject of neglected graveyards. Purbright allowed the debate to circle in its usual genteel fashion before intervening. Rising politely, he addressed no one in particular. "Forgive me," he began, in tones of mild inquiry, "but might I ask, who first noticed the disturbed ground by the north wall of the churchyard?"
"I cannot quite recall. The effect was subtle but sufficient. A shifting of weight upon chairs, a quick dart of eyes. It was Miss Trodd who spoke, voice tremulous. I believe it was I, Inspector. I walk through there on Tuesday mornings."
"For the, air?" "Indeed," Purbright replied, nodding. "Then it was your observation that brought the matter to wider attention. Quite commendable." Miss Trodd flushed. Mrs. Empson gave a thin smile, one that conveyed both vindication and irritation. Purbright continued, as though musing aloud, "And the scent of camphor that was remarked upon too, I believe. A very particular smell. Not something that drifts about by chance. Someone must have placed it there deliberately." His gaze drifted over the assembly, never settling, never accusing. "One wonders who in our midst makes such regular use of camphor. Uncommon stuff nowadays." He sat down. The silence that followed was more eloquent than speech. Miss Trodd clutched her notebook with white knuckles. Councillor Empson coughed and made a poor show of examining his shoes. Mrs. Empson rustled in her handbag, as though searching for indignation misfiled. Reverend Slatherwick looked bewildered, as though wondering whether the parish had authorized a pest control scheme without his knowledge. Sergeant Love leaned towards his superior. "You meant that, sir?" he whispered. Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, I meant only to inquire, Love. People are so very revealing when one merely inquires." The remainder of the evening proceeded with diminished enthusiasm. Arguments about renewal dwindled into polite mutterings about hymn selections. When at last the urn of tea was drained and the biscuits reduced to crumbs, the townsfolk departed in twos and threes, their voices lowered, their glances sharper than before. Purbright lingered just long enough to observe Miss Trodd hurrying out. Into the night, her step brisk, almost panicked. Councillor Empson followed more slowly, a shadow of calculation upon his face. Mrs. Empson, meanwhile, was heard to remark loudly about graveyard impropriety while fastening her husband's
scarf for him. When the hall was empty, Purbright and Love stepped into the cold air.
The inspector pulled on his gloves with deliberate patience. "You see, Love," he said quietly, "there are times when one need not hunt. It is enough to let the quarry betray its own unease." "Then you think one of them's guilty, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "I think, Love, that they are all guilty, though perhaps not all of the same thing. What concerns us is who among them fears the truth most keenly. Fear, after all, is rarely wasted effort." With that, he turned towards the station, leaving behind the vestry hall, a building which, for all its hymns and homilies, had that evening played host to something resembling a cross-examination. The committee room of Flaxborough's council. Offices had rarely looked so solemn. It was a room that usually heard only disputes about lamp-post sightings and objections to allotment fencing, yet now it bore witness to the final act of a rather more peculiar drama. Inspector Purbright sat at the head of the long varnished table, a tea-tray placed unobtrusively by his elbow. To his right, Sergeant Love fidgeted with his notebook. To his left, Reverend Slatherwick, who looked as though he had stumbled into the wrong parish entirely. The seats opposite were occupied in a strained silence, Mrs. Empson stiff-backed and glaring, Councillor Empson sagging slightly in what might have been resignation, and poor Miss Trodd, pale as a communion cloth, her notebook clasped like a shield. Purbright cleared his throat gently. "We are gathered," he said, his voice conversational rather than judicial, "not to pass judgment but to clarify certain misunderstandings, matters of graves, camphor, and what one might call misrepresentation." Miss Trod made a small sound, as though a confession had escaped her by accident. Mrs. Empson leaned forward, ready to deliver indignation by the ounce. Purbright continued. "It began, of course, with the disturbed ground by the north wall. At first, we thought of desecration, perhaps even of some grim attempt at concealment. Yet the truth, as is so often the case, proved at once less dreadful and more absurd." He let his eyes rest kindly on the Reverend. "You see, Slatherwick, no body was ever moved, nor intended to be. What we found was merely a shallow pit dug in preparation, a grave dug in advance, as it were." The vicar blinked. For whom?" Purbright's smile held a faint edge of irony. "For yourself, Reverend. At least that was the story being put about. There was a collective intake
of breath. Mrs. Empson's indignation stumbled quite uncharacteristically into silence.
Councillor Empson half rose from his chair before sinking back, as though gravity had doubled. Miss Trod buried her face in her hands. Purbright pressed on, gentle but relentless. "Rumours are curious things. They can ruin a reputation far more effectively than fact. Miss Trod, you were the first to mention the disturbed ground. You also, whether by accident or intention, spread the tale that the grave was yours to notice, yours to interpret. You feared, did you not, that others would learn of your correspondence with the Reverend?" Miss Trod whimpered.
"I never meant— It was only letters, Inspector, only words." "Quite so. Words of friendship, perhaps too effusive for parish taste. And yet, once Mrs. Empson seized upon them, the whole business turned from embarrassment into weaponry." He
turned his gaze upon the councillor's wife. "Your campaign, madam, was not against immorality but untidiness. You wished the Reverend replaced with a younger, sharper, more tractable incumbent. A vacancy was required. Hence the grave." Mrs. Empson bristled. "Inspector, I merely observed what anyone could see. Observed and embroidered. The smell of camphor, for instance, was not the vicar's at all. It came from your own husband's wardrobe, where he keeps his winter coats. You arranged to scatter it upon the soil to lend the appearance of mortuary business." Councillor Empson shifted, muttering. "I told you it would get out, Harriet." Purbright raised a hand, calm as ever. "No harm has been done, save to reputations already in delicate condition. But it was you, Mrs. Empson, who dug the shallow pit, not with intent of murder nor of true desecration, but of symbolism, a theatrical grave for a living priest, and a campaign of whispers to ensure it was noticed. The silence that followed was broken only by Sergeant Love's astonished scratch of pencil. The inspector poured himself tea. "We in the police are not, as a rule, guardians of parish reputations. But I must remind you, Mrs. Empson, that falsifying threats to public order is in itself a species of mischief. Let us therefore consider the matter formally closed, provided no further digging is undertaken to all, literal or otherwise." Miss Trod gave a gasp of relief. Councillor Empson slumped like a man reprieved from manual labour. Reverend Slatherwick dabbed his brow and looked faintly grateful to still be above ground. Mrs. Empson said nothing. She merely fastened her handbag with a snap that suggested this was not, in her view, the end of anything. Purbright sipped his tea, entirely untroubled. "You see," he said gently, "truth requires no grandeur of revelation. It only requires patience. and an ear for the human appetite for scandal. The market square, 2 mornings after the council room disclosure, looked much as it always did: delivery vans shouldering aside bicycles, dogs investigating butchers' trays with ambitions beyond their means, and a ring of pensioners installed. On the bench by the war memorial, all of them embarked upon their daily enterprise of interpreting the news. The news, of course, was not from Fleet Street nor even the Flaxborough Chronicle.
"It came from Mrs. Empson's handbag. Did you hear," began one of the bench elders with relish, "that the grave was never meant for a body at all, but for a reputation?" "Much the same thing in this town," remarked another. "Within these
Post office, Miss Trodd queued with her usual stack of envelopes. She held herself stiffly, aware that the counter-clerk smiled a little too knowingly when she asked for stamps. But Miss Trodd had determined, with a kind of tragic dignity, that she would continue to write her letters to distant cousins in Torquay as though none of this had ever happened. If the town chose to imagine epistles of passion to the vicar, well, that was the town's doing. She had survived worse humiliations. Councillor Empson, meanwhile, had taken to loitering in the library, a place he previously entered only under duress. His wife, temporarily subdued, confined herself to horticultural pursuits, digging in her garden with a briskness that caused the neighbours to watch with faint alarm. Several remarked, sotto voce, that the ground there looked as freshly disturbed as the north wall of the churchyard had ever done. As for Reverend Slatherwick, he presided over his next sermon with a tremor in his voice but a noticeable improvement. In attendance, parishioners who had scarcely been seen in months appeared in the pews, motivated less by devotion than by curiosity to witness the man who had so narrowly escaped premature interment. The vicar bore it with humility, though privately he wondered if gratitude was really the word for what he felt. At the police station, Sergeant Love recounted the whole business to a visiting constable from Almsworth. His version included much shaking of heads, plenty of references to female scheming, and at least one misremembered detail involving the undertaker's cat. Purbright, listening faintly through the half-open door, allowed the embellishments to go uncorrected. Stories, he reflected, had their uses. They made the world tolerable, even when not precisely accurate. In his office, the inspector sat at his desk, considering the paperwork now required. There was, of course, little enough to record. No charges were to be laid, no formal cautions issued. It was, in effect, a case that did not exist, at least not on file. But Flaxborough would remember it vividly. He paused, pen in hand, and looked out of the window at the neat row of chimneys edging the town. People, he thought, did not change so much as they adjusted their masks. A grave, dug in advance, was only the literal expression of what many did daily, preparing little plots for one another, ready to bury their neighbours under scandal the moment opportunity arose. And yet, despite all, the town functioned. Shops opened, bells rang, children squabbled, and somewhere in Mrs. Empson's sitting room a new campaign of improvement was already taking shape. Purbright sighed, signed the final page of his report, and placed it neatly in the tray marked "Completed." He reached for the cold cup of tea on his desk, tasted it, and gave a small, resigned nod. Life in Flaxborough, grave or no grave, was once again exactly as it had always been.